you ever wonder what it's like to first watch a movie based on a book that you've written? You have all these characters that you've visualized in your head for so long and so vividly, and I'm sure watching them on the screen for the first time must be a fairly alien experience. An experience, by the way, that I think composers can relate to. There is that moment as a composer when you are first listening to music that you've written but you've never heard before. I've experienced this moment many times, but most recently on David Bruce's amazingly ambitious challenge for 5 composers who are active on YouTube. David himself, classical pianist Nahre Soul, my buddy guitarist Ben Levin, Martin aka Tantacrul, and yours truly. The 5 of us were tasked to write a 1-minute composition for violin, cello, double bass, accordion, and clarinet based on shared musical themes, musical meme themes. This was an enormously exciting project. Definitely go check it out over at David Bruce's channel if you haven't already. But I wanted to talk about that moment, when I first heard the recording that David sent me of the Chroma Ensemble playing the piece that I had written for them. Of course, I saw that we'd be writing for accordion and clarinet, so I knew I needed to write something vaguely Balkan. For me, a really exciting combination of accordion and clarinet can be heard in Ivo Papazov and his wedding band, Bulgarian wedding music. The problem, of course, is that music is very difficult, but very specialized to those particular musicians and that ensemble. Before writing this piece for David, I didn't really know the musicians who were going to be playing it. Now, when the great American jazz composer Duke Ellington wrote for his band, every part that he wrote was specific to the player. In other words, he didn't write for trombone, he wrote for Juan Teasel. He didn't write for baritone sax, he wrote for Harry Carney. Ellington knew how the individual players blended with the ensemble and what their technical strengths and limitations were. The result was a music kind of unlike any other, and Ellington honestly is probably the only composer in history with the luxury of writing for basically the same musicians for over 40 years. I try and do that as much as I can, honestly. I try and write for the player and not the instrument. I don't write parts for drums, I write parts for Josh Bailey. I know what he likes to play and I know what he sounds good on. The problem is, of course, I didn't know who the individual players were who would be playing my music, which is rather unfortunate. It'd be like reading a book without being able to imagine what the characters look like. There'd be something missing there. But that said, I had total faith in their technical abilities, so I sent the piece over, and this is what they played. So this moment of listening back for the first time that I kind of just recreated for you with the iPad and everything was incredibly illuminating for me, partly because this was a more realized version of the piece than most composers would get when a reading session.
Quite often us composers only get just a few minutes or just a very short time to get a much longer piece into shape, and then we have to make judgments on that as composers and try and work out whether they did actually play it wrong or whether we'd actually just written something wrong.
The Chroma Ensemble clearly killed it here, and because of that I was able to learn a lot about what I would change about the orchestration. For example, I didn't really like the way that I wrote for the clarinet all that much. When he plays that Balkan Bulgarian wedding music, Ivo Papazov plays frequently in the altissimo or clarion registers, the upper registers of the clarinet, as this kind of bright siren above the rest of the loud band. But in the smaller and more intimate chamber music setting, that upper register really really didn't blend with the rest of the instruments the way that I wanted it to, so next time I will write differently for the clarinet. What's most interesting to me though is David sent some of the rehearsal footage of the session to me, and through that I could learn a little bit more about the players and what they were thinking.
Okay, so Adam Neely, take one.
At one point I required the double bass player to very quickly switch between playing pizzicato and arco, maybe too quickly switch. So the musicians made the executive decision to add an extra bar to aid in that transition.
One bar.
Adding one bar.
Yes. 10 bars of words. No?
Okay.
What's interesting is that the bar that they have added seems to be a measure of 3/4, even though the entire piece is in 5/8. There's another pause earlier on in the piece which also happens to be in 3/4. This is really interesting because during the rehearsal, whenever they were counting in sections, they were always counting in 5/8 as if it was 3/4.
Yeah.
Oh, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Oh, 1, 2, 3.
What exactly does this tell us? I actually don't know. It just tells me that there is some psychological link in this instance between 5/8 and 3/4, and something that I might want to explore a little bit in the future, but for right now it was just useful to see how these players were navigating these things. Another interesting thing is the players made the executive decision to always accent beats 1 and 4.
More rustic and more accented on the accented beats, like on 1 and 4 basically.
I thought this worked really beautifully in this orchestration to really emphasize the groove of this fast 3+2 5/8. Listening back to this music for the first time was incredibly inspiring. It got me thinking of other things I might want to try. For example, instead of emphasizing both beats 1 and 4, why don't we just emphasize beat 4? In jazz swing music, the downbeat is unaccented, the upbeat is accented, so if we did a fast 5/8 with this kind of jazz swing mentality, it would sound like this. That might work in this situation. Another interesting moment in this is how the double bass player initially started playing pizzicato.
Your opening bass line,
Yeah.
she first played it, she just played these sort of silent notes where you'd marked the X. And I had a feeling that that wasn't quite what you wanted. I was wondering if that was the sort of bass guitar technique.
My intention, although I didn't really write it down in the sheet music anywhere, was that for this groove she plays like a rockabilly bass player or a swing bass player from the 1930s by slapping the strings with her right hand. This slapping adds a rich transient that allows the bass to cut through a loud band as well as kind of act like a drummer, and I think it adds a really nice woody flavor to the groove. Very fortunately, that decision came about naturally in the rehearsal process.
You can stop it and slap it. Stop it and slap it.
Yeah, I could actually.
So you get that audible click now between the pitched notes, which creates a really good rhythmic effect, I think.
That's the other option, but it's very loud.
That's really good. I think that sounds good.
And serendipitously, something that I didn't imagine when I was writing down the music, that tone color of the slap works very nicely with something called the Bartok pizzicato. This is when the cellist plucks the strings really aggressively so the string bounces against the fingerboard. Kind of like a pop, an electric slap and pop technique. In the future, I'll keep that in mind when writing for similar orchestrations and similar players. You know, for me, writing minute-long compositions are very difficult because it's hard to have a fulfilling narrative arc in a short amount of time. And so you're really reliant on people to sell that story for you. This group, the Chroma Ensemble, did a fantastic job of selling this goofy little short story that I wrote, and as well as all the other composers in this project over at David Bruce's channel. I strongly recommend that you go and check out this collaboration. It really is something that's pretty awesome, and I'm glad to have been a part of it. It was incredibly inspiring to be part of, and it was an incredibly inspiring thing to first listen back to the music that I had written, not knowing what the hell I was gonna get. Fortunately, for me, I think it turned out really, really well, and I'm very happy about it.